All right, welcome back to the afternoon sessions. We are really happy to have a couple of more very inspiring talks coming up. And to introduce our next guest, I would invite Isabel Zorn of the IMM here on stage. Welcome, Isabel.
Thank you, Katharina. Yeah, hello everybody. My name is Isabel Zorn and I'm Professor of Media Literacy in the Institute for Media Education and Media Research, also here at the THK University in Cologne. It's my pleasure to introduce Rachel Kowert to you. Rachel is based in Texas and she's a trained psychologist and received her PhD at the University in York in UK. And not only has she been in the UK, she had also had a postdoc position here in Germany at the University of Münster. In this position, she worked in an EU-funded project where she worked on a longitudinal multi-method study on the social foundations of online gaming. Rachel also serves on the board of DIGRA, the Digital Games Research Association. And today, as she was invited as a keynote speaker for the Ethics in Digital Games Summit, today she will talk about how we use online gaming technology as an alternative social environment, alternative to the offline world. And she will give us insights into empirical studies on these technologies and their use by gamers. And Winfried Kaminski this morning told us about when he started this conference in 2005 and how online gaming was viewed a bit awkward by some people because gaming was mostly done by teenagers who really didn't have any social context and were quite isolated nerds. Well, in 2015, we still have many people, especially in the education sector, who wouldn't think gamers are only these teenagers, but maybe think that still people who game are actually quite isolated nerds. Rachel, is that an image that is actually true? I'm happy to hear what you can say from a psychologist perspective about this. Thank you. Welcome, welcome, Rachel.
Hello. Thank you all for staying. I'm happy to see you all here. My talk yesterday, as Isabel mentioned, at the summit, it focused on the potential negative impact of online games and how playing online games may negatively impact our offline social lives. And today I'm taking a bit of a different direction, and I'm going to talk about the potential to use our existing level of technology for online games and use them as potentially rehabilitative spaces. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute. As Isabel said, being an online gamer is pretty much synonymous with having some level of social incompetence. As you see in this comic strip here, that's pretty much what the online gamer is believed to be like, unable to effectively engage socially with other people in an offline context. So there are typically two arguments for this. Either there's some sort of media effect happening, so by playing online games, they're becoming socially incompetent, and that's what I talked about yesterday. And the other argument is that people who choose to play online games have some level of social incompetence that is pre-existing, and this is what motivates them to play online games, because they're accommodating and provide an alternative space, which I'm going to talk about in more detail. So, today I'm not just going to talk about the possibility of harnessing online games as sort of a social equivalent to physical therapy, in the sense that online games can provide kind of a safe social space where you can learn new skills and take these strategies you learn online into the offline world. But also the possibility that online games could maybe serve as alternative primary social outlets for people who have difficulty engaging in traditional social contexts. And by this, I mean offline communication. Now, the talk today is largely theoretical in the sense that, to my knowledge, online games are not currently being studied as these kind of socially rehabilitative spaces. But there is a lot of work that I'm going to talk about today that suggests that this may be possible in the near future. So in terms of breaking down this idea, I'm going to focus on 3 main points. First, we're going to talk about why I think online games make ideal alternative social outlets for socially vulnerable populations. And by this, I mean people who are depressed, people who are lonely, people who have high social anxiety or perhaps low social skills. So this is going to include a discussion of the range of social accommodations afforded in online games, and also how the unique integration of play within the social space of online games makes them particularly accommodating. Now, I mentioned that the talk is largely theoretical, but there's quite a bit of empirical work that has been done that can lend some insight into the possibility of them being compensatory spaces. And I'm going to talk about a few of these. That's the second point. And lastly, we're going to look at the possibility of online games to be rehabilitative spaces through the use of social learning. So this is the social equivalent of physical therapy. So while online games are often discussed as being limited in their ability to promote social learning, and I talked about that briefly yesterday, there are some arguments to suggest that they might actually be ideal for learning specific kinds of skills. So from the top. So online games, as I mentioned, are believed to be socially advantageous for a range of different groups. Lonely, depressed, socially anxious, socially unskilled, and shy. And the reason for this is because online games integrate a socially accommodating space within a playful space. So computer-mediated communication generally provides a range of social accommodations, which we may be familiar with. Visual anonymity, a lack of nonverbal cues. Combined, these give you greater control over your social self-presentation and allow for a more crafted impression formation, and can reduce social self-consciousness. Now, I know there's game designers in here. So game designers came up with emoticon systems and in-game gesturing systems, and this was in an attempt to make up for the lack of nonverbal cues that you have in text-based communication. And research has shown that this does make up for a lot of the lack of nonverbal communication that we have in games. But you typically have to directly express them. So when you're talking face-to-face, you're getting a lot of nonverbal information from me right now, my gestures, my movement, my eye contact. But in a game, or in a text-based, I guess is the way I should say it, venue, you would get the entire message and the gesture at the end. So rather than it being some kind of fluid interaction between the verbal and the nonverbal, it's a bit disjointed. So it's not fully accommodating for what we have in face-to-face communication. Online games that use text-based communication, they also have asynchronous communication. So this allows you, as I mentioned, you send the message in its entirety so you can carefully craft what you're going to say. This allows for a wide range of self-presentation strategies and can accommodate for any problem you may have with verbal fluency. So you can craft, you can edit, you can recraft what it is you want to say until it sounds just right, and then you can send it. And we don't get to do this in face-to-face communication. Now, games specifically also have their accommodations, for instance, avatar-based play. So by being able to craft how you're presented physically to people in the environment, this has been shown to mediate a lot of social anxiety as it provides greater social control, and you can present yourself in an idealized type of way. And also a shared activity, which is perhaps one of the most important points, because the shared activity not only provides a topic of conversation, so if you have difficulty engaging in conversation, you have this whole world that provides a lot of things you can talk about, and it also provides kind of a built-in delay. So if you have a level of social anxiety and you're not sure exactly how to respond, you can take your time and say, oh, I was busy, I was, fighting, whatever, and it provides this delay and no one even second guesses it. It's like the lack of an awkward silence. So the shared activity greatly reduces the pressure to both engage and to guide the topic of conversation. So taken together, all of these accommodations, the ones unique to games and the ones that we see in different kinds of computer-mediated communication, generates an environment that's perceived as less threatening than you find in face-to-face communication. But games aren't just social, right? They're games at the end of the day. The online games, social aspect is a big part of it, but the game is the bigger part of it. Now, we find in other mediated spaces, people make friends, but it's the playful nature of online games that makes the friendships in online games particularly unique, and what makes online games particularly suited as these alternative social spaces. So the playful nature, having these shared activities, they reinforce friendships, they strengthen friendships, and they're shown to lead to more long-lasting and more close, more intimate friendship bonds than you find in other mediated channels. So, these characteristics make highly desirable spaces. They give you greater flexibility in your communication. They enhance your social presentation strategies, both through the way you're communicating with your messages and also in the way you're presenting yourself within the space. And the shared experiences, these all work together. And together, these diminish the possibility of social rejection and also stimulate the formation of friendships. Put perhaps a more formal way, or the way you see in the scientific literature, is this is what you call the social compensation hypothesis. So because of these accommodations, the argument is people who are more socially anxious, people who are more geographically isolated, whatever it may be, people with low social resources, are more drawn to online games because of the socialization patterns within them, and this leads to increased gameplay. There's a lot of research that supports this idea. Here's just some of them. You see at the top, Kaplan found loneliness to be the biggest predictor of online game use, with lonelier participants reporting that they played online games more. Shannon Williams found the more socially motivated players were more lonely. Williams found higher rates of depression among his online gaming population than the general population. Griffiths found more involved players to have higher social anxiety and worse social skills than the less involved players. And I did a study in 2013 that found similar linear relationships. The more involved players had worse social skills. There have also been 2 longitudinal studies in this area, one by Lemons, and then I did a replication of this Lemons study this year, and I'm going to talk about those in more detail as we move on to the second point, which is online games as socially compensatory spaces. I should have picked a word that was easier to say than that. Okay, so we know why online games are believed to be advantageous. That's what we just talked about. So let's look at a bit of the research. I'm just going to explore a few of these populations. First, shy. Most of the research, as you can see from the citation list, shy has been a big percentage of the research, and it's because shyness is thought to hold significant relationships with social uses of the internet and gameplay specifically. Online gameplay has been pinpointed as being particularly accommodating. Here's kind of a long quote, but I think it makes a good point. As internet-based social spaces reduce inhibitions, shyness is not an obstacle to effective communication, which makes them highly desirable. In this sense, online games may be exceptionally accommodating, as unlike chat rooms, where your primary purpose and sole function is to directly socialize, online games can provide a strong social community, even in the absence of direct socialization, which is a bit of the alone together argument, which we heard a bit about earlier. So I did a study under the Sofica project in Münster. They mentioned I was in Germany for a few years. Do not speak German to me, I don't understand it, but I did live there for a few years. And we did a study looking at the relationship between online gameplay and shyness using a measure of emotional sensitivity, which I will explain in just a second. And the point here was to look at the extent in which online gameplay may provide tangible social benefits for the players who are more shy. Now, emotional sensitivity is a social skill, which is defined as the ability to interpret the nonverbal cues of others. And the reason we chose to define shyness as a skill rather than a disposition is to get a better evaluation of how it's impacting their socialization. So this is the difference between saying I can accurately tell, so this is a skill, an ability, versus I would describe myself as shy. So we're trying to get at the behavioral components. So high emotional sensitivity is indicative of shyness. It represents a hypersensitivity to the nonverbal emotional cues of others. Similar to shyness, if you have high emotional sensitivity, you experience discomfort or inhibition in interpersonal situations. You are socially self-conscious. You may avoid social situations. And it's also related to personality factors associated with sensitivity, like apprehensiveness. Oh my God. To measure it, we used a short scale. The SOFICA project was a very large project. I'm going to talk about it several times today. You couldn't really use full scales in anything to try to get all the questions in. So it was a 3-item scale. Now, since we were looking at the tangible results, we also looked at friendship circles. We did not specifically define it. If you look at the literature, there's 100 definitions for friends. But since it can mean different things to different people, we left it ambiguous on purpose. And we looked at 3 different kinds of friendships. Friends that they only had within their online games, friends that they met online originally and then took them offline and hung out with them offline, and their offline friends who they then brought into their online gaming worlds. Now, since we know shyness has specific relationships with social uses of the internet, and online games hold the potential to compensate for these difficulties, we predicted that the more shy players would have more, they would play more, first of all, than the less shy players, that they would report a greater number of online friends met online, and they would report a greater number of offline friends transferred online. And it's perhaps the third prediction that is the most interesting, because this would suggest that they are taking their friends that they already have offline and then bringing them into a somewhat safer online environment potentially in order to help maintain that relationship in a more accommodating space. So as I mentioned, this was the SOFICA project. It had 3 waves. This data comes from the 3rd wave. There's just some demographic information. For the results I'm going to show you, gender and age have shown significant relationships with both gaming in terms of how much people game, but also in terms of friendship outcomes. Girls tend to have larger social circles and that sort of thing. So these factors were partialed out in the results, so we would just be looking at what we were interested in. So the first thing we did is a median split, and I see Johannes eyeing me from over there, just to look at differences between high shyness and low shyness in terms of how much they play. And here is the result of that. You see there's no significant differences in how much they said they invested in online social play. So this does not support our first prediction. We then looked at the different friendship circles. And here you see that people who are more shy, the high ES category, do report more friends. In all 3 categories, the online-only friends was not significant, but the variance between participants was very extreme, and I think that that's most likely why, because you can see the average is substantially higher than the other group. Now, social skills, since we measured it as a skill, this can be a binary distinction. You have a skill or you don't have a skill, or it can be thought of on a linear trend. So we also did a regression and looked at these outcomes linearly. So that's the important line right there. And you see the relationships are significant and they're all positive. So as emotional sensitivity increased, we saw an increase in 3 different kinds of friendships. So from this study, we can say that people who are more shy in terms of higher emotional sensitivity don't play more, but they are reporting a greater number of friends in all categories. As I mentioned, the first one probably wasn't significant because the variance was crazy. They also showed a greater prevalence of modality switching in both ways, so taking their offline friends online and their online friends offline. And in terms of the regression, the linear analysis, again, we see higher rates corresponded with more friendships of all kinds. And I think the important conclusion here is that they're using them differently, which is what we would expect them to do. So people who are more shy seem to be using them to successfully expand their social circle. They're making more friends online. They're using it to maintain their pre-existing friendships by bringing offline friends online. And from this, we can suggest that they hold the potential, at least in terms of expanding the social circle, by allowing shy people to generate new friendships and strengthen old friendships. So that's shy individuals. If we look at some of these other groups, though, the results are maybe slightly different. And here's where the longitudinal research I mentioned comes into play. I mentioned this study yesterday, but I'm going to mention it in a lot more detail today. There's a 2011 study from Lemons that's really great. It's a longitudinal study. It followed the same adolescent participants over 6 months, and they assessed a range of psychosocial outcomes and problematic play. So loneliness, life satisfaction, social competence, and self-esteem. Okay, I understand you can't read the numbers, but I'll tell you. So this is the outcome of Lemons, and the important things here are Path B and Path C. So Path B is the social compensation path. So it's the idea that loneliness, life satisfaction, social competence, and self-esteem in time 1 would predict problematic play in time 2. And Path C is the media effect. So if pathological gaming in time 1 predicts psychosocial outcomes in time 2. And what we find here is that lower social competence and lower self-esteem and higher loneliness in time 1 predicted increased problematic play in time 2. Now in Path C, which is the media effects column, there's also a positive relationship with loneliness. So Lemons concludes that this is demonstrating that online gameplay is both a cause and a consequence. So being more lonely predicts you'll play problematically, and playing problematically also predicts you'll be more lonely. But Lemons' work only looked at the relationship with pathological players, problematic players, and adolescent players. So in order to get an idea about how this may impact the broader community, I did a replication of his study using a broader sample, using a representative sample of game players over a longer period of time as well. This comes from the Sofica project. So we looked at the psychosocial causes and consequences, the same measures, among a representative sample over a 1 and 2 year period. So we had 922 participants, and so we could compare results to those of Lemons and see if they held within this broad population. We split between different age groups. So we had our adolescent group, and that was our comparable group to Lemons. We had young adults, which research shows is actually the largest demographic of game players. And then we had older adults, who tend to be the less engaged of the groups of game players. As I mentioned, we did the same measures, but the time difference was much longer. You'll notice the difference in years between, so loneliness and self-esteem are 1 year, and life satisfaction and social competence were 2 years, but that's just an artifact of the study. Because it was the same-ish questionnaire over 3 years, you couldn't actually have all the same questions in all 3 questionnaires. So we had to just deal with that when we were looking at it. We also looked at involvement in 2 ways. Do you play online games, and how much do you play online games? And it was the same kind of analysis, cross-legged path analysis, being a player, and as I mentioned, we also looked at frequency. So in terms of adolescents, here we see the results for adolescents, and the only significant thing you see is the media effect there, which is a positive one. So what we found is that being an online game player in time 1 predicted greater life satisfaction in time 2, which is good for us, right? And then in terms of frequency, there was nothing significant. And then we looked at adults. Now in adults, it's slightly different, which is interesting in and of itself. So lower life satisfaction and lower social competence in time 1 predicted you'd be more likely to play online games. But in terms of frequency, only social competence held. So being more socially incompetent predicted you'd be a player and that you would play more. So for adolescents, we didn't replicate Lemon's findings, right? So there was not evidence that lower psychosocial outcomes would predict that you would play or that you would play more. And we actually found that positive finding with life satisfaction, which likely reflects the fact that online gaming is really a peer activity that a lot of adolescents engage in, and it probably generates greater life satisfaction because they're engaging in it with their friends. Now, the findings being in contrast to Lemon's likely means that the relationships he found are either short-term, because our social competence outcomes were over 2 years, which is much different time frame than 6 months, especially among adolescents who are constantly developing, or it's related to problematic players specifically and not applicable to the broader game-playing group. Now, for adults, we found what Lemon's found basically is that lower social competence predicted play and it predicted increased play. And we also found adults who are less satisfied with their lives were more likely to play online games. And I think this supports the idea that it may be socially compensating, or at the very least, people think that it may be socially compensating. And so if they are less socially competent and experiencing less social success, they may then be drawn to engage within these spaces. The weird thing here, though, is that with the media effects, besides the life satisfaction, it didn't really seem to provide any benefits. The argument would be that people with less psychosocial well-being would enter these spaces and they would then provide these benefits. So we have to conclude, at least from this one study, which of course is just one, that it's not directly contributing to greater self-esteem, to greater life satisfaction among adults, to lower loneliness, or to more social competence. But I think we should definitely take this with some salt because, again, it's one study. Secondly, it might be providing benefits that we did not measure. Like we saw with the Shy study, it may be giving them greater social circle. We didn't measure that in this particular study. It may be improving their friendship quality. There's a whole host of things it could be doing. There we go. So it's not that it doesn't provide any, just not an improvement in these specific outcomes. Similarly, we can't conclude that it does not contribute negatively for anything. We didn't see it here, but it could contribute to negative outcomes in other ways. Okay, so the study I just described did not find positive media effects in the sense that online gaming contributing to a positive psychosocial outcomes, but they could be providing other benefits, for instance, through social learning, which is a rather large area of study. So now, since we can say that these spaces do seem to be compensatory, they are being used to successfully compensate for some difficulties, for instance, as we saw the expansion of social circles for shy individuals. The next question then would be, are they taking what they're learning in these spaces or experiencing in these spaces and taking them offline? We don't live our lives online quite yet, completely. So like these ballerinas learn from their teacher, our players learning things through social modeling. Unlike traditional contexts, they would be able to rehearse their skills and gain feedback and relatively free from immediate social repercussions, which is the argument that's usually given in terms of online games being particularly adept at being kind of this social learning environment. Now, I'm referring to unintentional learning because games aren't specifically designed, at least World of Warcraft is not specifically designed to teach you skills, but because they're highly social spaces, because you are in an environment that's heavily populated, it seems reasonable to expect that some kind of social learning may be happening. Now, extensive research hasn't been conducted in this area. It has been suggested, however, that it might actually be a perfect environment for cognitive social learning because you can observe others, you can rehearse, and you can get feedback. And if you observe and rehearse and fail, you go somewhere else and you rehearse and observe and get feedback from someone else. Now, there's a lot of research on games and learning. It's kind of, we had the Media Education Summit the other day. There's a lot of research on games and learning, but very little in terms of games and social learning in the sense of learning social skills or social strategies that you then take off into other contexts. Now, despite this, we see a quote here from Steinkuhler and Williams, who guessed that online games can diversify your worldviews because you're in a space that's heavily populated by people from all over the world, all different backgrounds, all different ages. We then interact with them, we observe, we rehearse, we gain feedback, and our broad social immersion within these spaces could then expand our worldviews and increase our general sociability. That's what they guessed. Now, I haven't seen any work to support that, but it seems reasonable. Now, when I talk about games and social learning, I guess the elephant in the room is the leadership skills research, because there's a lot of research in this area, and that people who play online games make better leaders. We saw this in one of the talks earlier. There's been a lot of work. Even mainstream people are picking this up. Forbes, IBM did a study. People are actively seeking. I've seen more than one article that says, do you play MMOs? Put it on your CV. People will think you're fantastic. And I think that this is a good sign. So this is showing that unintentional learning, in a sense of social learning, the learning of leadership skills, is happening. So World of Warcraft is not specifically teaching you leadership skills. It's providing an environment in which you can practice them, in which you can succeed or fail. You can then adopt your strategy, and they're taking this into the real world, into the boardroom, into IBM, whatever. So it's unclear if this similar transitional learning is happening for other kinds of social skills, but this is a good sign that it could, or maybe does. So my concluding thoughts, do online games hold the potential to be alternative social outlets? And by this I mean spaces in which they can go, in which they can be socially accommodated in a way that they feel safe, and it can then contribute to their well-being. Because if it's not positively contributing to their well-being, it's not very viable as an alternative social outlet. But in terms of this second question, a lot of question marks, I think. We don't see that it's contributing significantly to negative effects. I discussed negative effects yesterday, but these effects are very small in magnitude, and we're not seeing them as these global effects between different groups. Can it be, okay, so the bigger question then is, can it augment the social networks for socially vulnerable populations? And I would say preliminary evidence suggests that it can. We're seeing the modality switching among shy individuals. They're expanding their social circles. They're bringing their friends in to maybe increase the intimacy of the friendships in these spaces in which they feel safe. And I think that this is important. This modality switching is maybe the most important point, because the main argument against online gaming friends being worse or being less valuable and all those things that we constantly hear is the fact that they don't provide tangible favors. It's always, they can't help you move. They're not real friends. And it's like, my friends don't want to help me move ever, but, you know? So, but the instance of modality switching takes that argument away, right? So they're taking them offline. Now they can provide everything. They can also not help them move. So I have a small note for designers. There's a lot of designers here. And I didn't forget you. Uncovering the elements of the game that are accommodating and that are contributing, not attributing, to the reduced social self-consciousness and increased control is half the battle. So we need more research in the area, not just looking over time, not just looking at a range of well-being outcomes and seeing if these spaces can be viable in this way, but we need to know what elements are contributing to that. Is it the use of avatar play? Is it being in a fantasy setting is better than being in a realistic setting? And those kinds of questions. So that is all. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Rick. Well, I'm just going to raise my voice until this comes up. Yes, thank you very much. It was very compelling research presented here, and I think there are a lot of questions from the audience. There we are. No, they are not shy, so we can really support the research here.
Hey, thanks for the talk. Yeah. I have a bit of a stupid question, maybe. Well, no question is stupid, but so let's assume that a lot of people with low social resources play online. Mm-hmm. Then the question is is that a good environment to learn social skills if you're among people that don't have social skills?
Yes, that is an argument that has absolutely been made. The research I've done looking at the relationship between social skills and gaming does not suggest that online gamers are globally socially incompetent like we see in the picture in the beginning. The research does generally suggest that if you play more, you may experience a decline in specific abilities, like the abilities to verbally engage others and that sort of thing. But I think maybe more nuanced research is needed, like the skills that you would be gaining in the online gaming spaces may not necessarily be skills that are poor, right? So you gain different skills online, maybe, I can't even think of it, like the ability to guide the content of a conversation, right? You wouldn't be learning the bad skills like not being able to walk up to someone in a bar and hit on them because you're not doing that in the online gaming spaces.
I have a kind of counter-argument.
Yeah.
So even though not the entire global online population...
Yeah.
So a bit of a counter-argument. So if we assume not all of the online players have low social skills,
Yeah.
you could still have the effect that these players with low social skills group together through shared experience and isolate themselves from the rest. Like if you look at phenomena like Gamergate, which I think comes from this kind of dynamic of people with a certain set of social, I don't know how to call this without sounding politically incorrect, but they kind of find people with the same mindset and then they build their own bubble and then like increase their maladjustment.
That could be said though of a lot of different social things that happen. I don't know if that's specific to games. I understand what you're saying, and that is, of course, always a possibility, but I think that that's a minority of what would happen. But Gamergate's a good example, yeah.
Questions?
Hi, just a thought. Haven't the social competences changed over time? Mm-hmm. If you see to get made for life, you have to be able to put up a very special Tinder profile sometimes. And does the gamification of social interaction have influence, and does the group who has experience in online games profit from that?
Right, exactly. So that's another good line of research about the skills, the specific skills, online skills, right? Online social skills, that is a thing now, and it's going to be even greater in the future. But I think the argument with this research is that your entire world is not online yet. There's still interaction with people in less socially accommodating spaces. You still have to talk with people and try not to have the awkward silence, right? But absolutely. And I think in the future, it's going to be more research into that. What are these online skills that we're learning, and the people who aren't online are not learning them, and now they're at some kind of social disadvantage.
Thanks for the talk. And so we've done a little bit of work in looking at developmental courses of young kids, 8 to 12-year-olds. And one of the positive things we see is that kids who play more socially, games in general, tend to have better peer relations, at least self-reported. And that's a nice positive thing. But the things that we don't do, and I don't see any in the developmental or even communication science literature, is look at all the other things they do. So right now, if you don't game online a little bit, if you're not playing half an hour of Minecraft a day or something like that, you're probably going to be isolated in your normal offline life, because that's what everybody's talking about. But there's something about balance, and I suspect that you've got a lot of your data when you see sometimes it's supporting your argument and sometimes it's not, is because it's a curvilinear function, and you've got some level of online social interactions are a really good thing. Too much is not great, and too little is not good either. And so I'm wondering if you can look at some of those curvilinear relations in your longitudinal data.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I haven't looked at that. I should. That's a very good point. I have a friend who does Facebook research, and she found the exact same thing. So if you're not on Facebook in that particular age group, then you absolutely are missing out on some things because it's the norm now. So that's a good point. Thank you.
Any more questions? There's Stefan.
thank you for your talk first. And you know probably very well the two papers of Bartel about the classification of players in online games. The first one in 90, I don't remember, and the second one beginning 2004 or 2006. And in the second paper, he said, I know that this paper is very controversial, but he said that the progression of the state of a player go from an isolated point of view to the fact that he's becoming more and more social. He's changing role according to the sixth role of Bartel classification until he becomes some kind of leader. Do you have anything which support or controverse this point of view of the evolution of Bartel's player?
Yeah, I don't have anything off the top of my head that supports or denies that, but right. So when you go online, you can try on these new roles and you can do these different things and you can learn these different skills. And I'm gonna have to think about that one. Thank you. Thought-provoking. I don't know.
Are there any more questions? Yeah.
So thank you for the clarity of your presentation. I'm so uncomfortable with the pathologizing of gamers. Do people study watching football or listening to classical music or reading novels in the same way as potentially impacting social skills and selecting for people with social skills? I mean, it looks like a classic case of finding what one looks for.
Right. We talked about this a lot in the summit yesterday. That's a lot of people's first impression when they see this kind of research. Yes, they do it about books, and they did it about Elvis, and they did it about television, and they did very similar pathological, the word you said.
But what about the things that I suspect, like watching football or not eating enough chocolate or,
right.
You know, I can think of a lot of things that people could do that would, that I think is...
Right,
well,
but we don't see these global panics about that happening. I think
I
that's
know
the
there's
point.
a panic, but
Yeah.
I mean, but it's just correlation
Well,
in the data. So
I
the
agree with
data
you.
I know.
Yeah.
No, I'm just
Yeah.
I'm just I'm asking your perspective on what other why people tolerate this kind of investigation.
Yeah.
I guess.
I think it's what makes the panic specific to games in the social aspect is that the people they're interacting with are perceived as being less valuable. The perception is I'm not talking to you, Janet, I'm talking to you, Janet, and the Janet in here is somehow less valuable than the Janet I'm talking to out here.
So
and that's just I think that's the root of it.
That's a mistake.
Well, yeah.
Yeah. And Sherry Turkle makes the same mistake lately, but she's the mother of former adolescents, so one can understand. But I understand why she has why she went off the deep end.
Any more questions? Yes, I'm gonna. Where was it?
Hi. Well, I think there are other things that we have now in technology, like we have social networks, we have our smartphones, and I think we're interacting in a different way that we were doing before. So I think it's not such a matter of shyness, but this is more related on how we are using technology to interact. So there are people that are becoming friends online on Facebook, WhatsApp, Twitter, and whatever is gonna come next. And I think this is also something you have to look and take in account.
Yeah, I agree. It's very well documented that people make a lot of friends in these different kinds of networks that we have today. I think that what makes online games special is that many people have found that the friends in online games are different than the friends we're making in other places. They're more long-lasting, they're more intimate, they're closer. And with the advent of smartphones, that too, it is different. We are interacting differently, but we also now have games on our smartphones, and we have games everywhere, and we're constantly connected all the time. So it is changing the dynamic. It's not like it was in the beginning, in the first Clash of Realities, when these people, this is the only way that they're communicating, because now we have the advent of everything else. So in that sense, it has changed, definitely. But we still have, if you ask someone who's not in the gaming industry or someone who doesn't study games, describe an online gamer and describe someone that uses Twitter and describe someone that uses Facebook, they're completely different. You're going to see, oh, the gamer is incompetent and the Twitter user is, you know, just like me, everyone else. Everyone uses Facebook and that sort of thing. So the stereotype's still there despite the fact that we're seeing these different ways that we can interact.
Okay, I have another question. I saw that the research is focused mostly on teenagers and adults.
Mm-hmm.
But I was wondering if there's also a research on elderly people.
Yes.
People that are already retired or have a lot of free time, and maybe this can have online gaming can have a positive effect on their social and on their day-to-day basis. I mean, basically they have a lot of free time that can invest in playing games and actually socializing with other people. Is there a research there that maybe it can have a positive effect on them?
Yes, there is some work by Professor Quant and some of my colleagues from Münster, and also Hannah Martson. She used to be at Cologne. I don't think she was at a different institution in Cologne, who also focuses on that. But it's much less because I guess studying elderly gamers is not sexy. Not a lot of people do it, but it does exist. There is some out there, and it's showing that it's a positive thing.
All right. Thank you very much, Rachel.